So my name is Ashley Hill. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Epidemiology in the Graduate School of Public Health at the University of Pittsburgh. I'm joined today by my colleague, Dr. Lanisa Stokes, who is a postdoctoral scholar in the Division of Adolescent and Young Adult Medicine. And today we're going to talk to you about a research study that we are conducting through the University of Pittsburgh and UPMC Children's to really understand the environment for sexual misconduct in our university setting, and to try to understand some of the things that we can do to improve the environment to allow for better reporting, but also ultimately to eliminate these experiences from happening. So we're excited to talk to you a little bit about this today and some of the frameworks and structures that historically have led us to this point. And so we're going to begin with Dr. Stokes giving a bit of an overview of the project, and I will turn the floor over to her now. So please, Lanisa, guide me as you need slides changed. I'm having a screen, I'm sharing my screen, but I can't see any of you. So just let me know when you're ready to go.
Absolutely. So to piggyback on what Dr. Hill said, we, as I believe you can probably all appreciate, we find ourselves in challenging times navigating technology. So to catch everybody up in the audience, Dr. Hill can navigate the slides, but she can't see us. And I can monitor the chat, but I'm not navigating the slides. So I and Dr. Hill ask for your patience as we do this tag team approach. So as Dr. Hill already mentioned, my name is Lanisa Stokes. I am indeed a postdoctoral scholar in the Division of Adolescent and Young Adult Medicine, where I first met Dr. Hill before she went on to the School of Public Health at Pitt. And as she already mentioned, today is going to give you all, the audience, a brief overview of a project, really our first collaboration together, even though it is still ongoing. And time permitting and audience interest permitting, she and I can talk about how the ways in which this project has served as a foundation for next steps and future projects. Next slide, please. So in fact, I've already done the introduction. You all know who we are. So I'm going to kick this off with the preliminary findings from the BWA study. But before we get to that, I just want to thank you all for taking the time and making the choice to attend our session. For those of you who have been at this summit since the beginning, it has been truly amazing. So if I can presume to speak for Dr. Hill, and I will certainly speak for myself, I feel honored to be a part of this space to center Black girls' experiences and needs. So thank you all for coming today. Next slide, please. So for a little bit of context, more proximal context, the BWA study, Black Women in Academia, gets its most immediate origins from a now not so recent 2019 survey that was conducted at the University of Pittsburgh, where they surveyed both undergraduate men and women and transgender non-binary undergraduate and graduate students, asking them a whole host of questions, both about their own experiences with sexual misconduct victimization, their perceptions of the campus environment, and really just a whole host of questions as it pertains to sexual violence misconduct and what can be done in that space. And so the grant for BWA comes from university's provost office in response to that survey. And so this slide just gives you a little bit of a brief overview of, and I don't even want to say of what sexual misconduct experiences are like at Pitt, because obviously it's a survey, not everybody took the survey, but it gives you just at least the foundation of what that looks like. And I include these points because this served as the starting point for our grant application and the project that we're doing. So as you see here, roughly 2,400 undergraduate women completed the survey in 2019. And the main takeaways from this slide are as follows. You'll see that there are some categories of sexual misconduct victimization, and that ranges from such things as dating violence, intimate partner violence, stalking, sexual harassment, sexual assault, or coercion. You see that there are some examples of sexual misconduct victimization that Black undergraduate women were overly represented. So for example, we see that rounding up 24% of Black undergraduate women at Pitt compared to 17% of white undergraduate women, reported that since coming to the university, they had experienced intimate partner violence. We see that about 15% of Black undergraduate women, compared to 12% of white undergraduate women, say that they have been stalked since coming to the university. And then we see, as I said, some examples where there is similar percentages. About 27% of Black undergraduate women and white undergraduate women reported that they had experienced sexual assault or touching that involved physical force or the inability to consent. And then lastly, we see that 57% of Black undergraduate women, compared to about 63% of white undergraduate women, reported experiencing harassing behavior. And as I said, this is just a snapshot of those who are surveyed. We know, based on research, clinical work, that many populations who experience sexual misconduct victimization don't report those experiences for a whole host of reasons. So if anything, I would say that these numbers, these percentages are less than the reality out there. Next slide, please. And so using those data, I, Dr. Hill, and our mentor, Dr. Liz Miller, decided to submit an application to the provost office where they were requesting grants to really address various issues related to sexual misconduct victimization. And so I'm not going to go through all these aims, but basically, as you can hopefully appreciate, our study is rather ambitious. We have 4 aims, the first 2 of which I'm going to share with you a little bit today. Next slide, please. So aim 1, and this is taken directly from the grant. So before we even got started with data collection or anything of that sort, I had this, I don't think it was a lofty idea, but I had this idea that we would do the scoping review, which is kind of a fancy way of saying, look at the breadth of the literature on a topic of interest, and that based on this scoping review, we would be able to go to the university and give them a list of programs that had either been developed for or used with Black undergraduate women, and that we would propose based on this scoping review that we, that Pitt should consider doing such programming. So that was the lofty goal, that there would be multiple programs out there to choose from, and that our scoping review would help us to figure out like what seems like the best practices, if you will. So that is sort of my summary of what this aim was, that we would do a scoping review to find out what prevention programs and practices exist for students of color in general and Black undergraduate women in particular. And that, beyond just naming such programs, we would want to be able to name those that were shown to be effective in reducing negative outcomes associated with sexual misconduct. Now, having spent off and on about a year in this process, I can say that from that lofty goal, we have had to adapt our expectations based on what is out there. And I will share with you a little bit, not hopefully too much in the weeds of the process, but get to the sort of the preliminary conclusions that we have so far. Next slide, please. And so before I get to what our preliminary findings are, and I have to say, I don't know if y'all have the opportunity to unmute or if this needs to be in the chat, but we'll make it work. My questions to you before I share with you what my scoping review team has found thus far is, just because I was unaware of any programming before I embarked on this journey, doesn't mean that others are similarly unaware. And so my question to you all is, what programming or intervention strategies are you aware of or have actually used that are designed to prevent sexual misconduct victimization among Black female adolescents and young adults? And I intentionally removed sort of the college setting from it because I'm curious to hear about any programming that y'all are aware of or have used for Black adolescents and young adults. So think about, I'll be generous, 16 to 25, anything that you're aware of. And so if you can unmute and feel so inclined to answer out loud, please do so. If you have a response and want to put that in the chat, I will monitor it. So I'll give you a moment to sort of mull that over. So
yeah, I think while people are talking, Lanisa, I can kind of talk a little bit about one of the programs specifically that we had and that I evaluated out of Children's Hospital, which was the Sisterhood 2.0 program. And so that program was specifically adapted from a violence prevention toolkit that was tested and validated in Brazil for females of color. And locally, many of the various collaborators with the Black Girls Equity Alliance have been able to participate in or have become aware of the Sisterhood program over various years of us being able to present at this venue and talk a little bit about it. So one of the things that I got to do a couple of years ago was really evaluate that program as a violence prevention intervention and as a tool for sexual health promotion. And tomorrow I'll be in a different fireside chat presentation talking a little bit about what health and wellness looks like for Black girls and how we've been able to collaborate through BGEA to support some of those needs. But the Sisterhood 2.0 program is one that we have found to be very effective in improving bystander behaviors, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But also that the peer support and the positive engagement with a trusted adult were some of the main things that were really important in that particular program. So again, it was implemented specifically for Black females aged 13 to 19 in community-based settings, led by facilitators who delivered the curriculum and facilitated these sessions with the girls. And they were very familiar with them. And so I think some of the positive youth development aspects of that program have really been helpful. And I think more so the peer and adult support network that it created, while it did not specifically improve or prevent them from having these experiences, it did allow them to be able to identify healthy and unhealthy relationships, sort of as a precursor to entering into a partnership that could become violent. And I think it also really helped them to solidify a lot of their peer support networks and adult support networks. So that's just one example of one thing that we have had some connection with and that we've been able to implement locally.
So yeah, thank you for sharing that example, Dr. Hill. And we have a comment in the chat, which is I prefaced the start of this saying, so I can see the chat, she can't, but I can see people, she can. It's a whole thing. And so we have, thank you. One of the attendees says, yes, I'm currently using Sisterhood 2.0 now. And, you know, I'll come back to that example in a little bit when I share with you how we approached our scoping review process. So thank you for that comment, both Dr. Hill and our attendee in the chat. Thank you both. And what about programming or intervention strategies you're aware of or have used that are designed to treat or improve outcomes for Black female adolescents and young adults who have experienced sexual misconduct victimization? So same thing, feel free to unmute if you feel so inclined or put in the chat. And so feel free as we move forward, if things occur to you as we go on, feel free to put that in the chat. And if we've timed this right, we should have time at the end for questions and comments, so we can come back to that. And so I asked these questions intentionally because I said, just because I was unaware of and couldn't name, now prior to coming to Pitt, because as Dr. Hill mentioned, Sisterhood 2.0 is a good example of programming that would be relevant. Just because I was unaware of any before starting this project, I didn't want to presume that, again, my knowledge was the base for everyone else's. And I see something else coming up in the chat. Thank you. As the executive director of Pittsburgh Action Against Rape, I am hoping to gain some good information during the session as we were looking to deepen our work in this space. PAR hasn't always been seen as a welcoming place for Black female clients. Thank you for that comment. I greatly appreciate that. So yeah, and so basically, next slide, please. I went into this not quite knowing what was out there, and to basically spoil the ending, we are not finished with the scoping review, but we are in the midst of this process, basically not finding a whole lot that is centered around Black female college populations. And so we'll talk a little about that. And so I think only because I might have gone a little bit too in the weeds in terms of giving you background. I'm going to go through this quickly just so you know how we got to our findings. And I am more than willing to go back and go deep in the weeds because we've been on this process for a year, so I can go as deep as people want. But at the end, because I don't think this is the most interesting part, basically we have a scoping review team. It is myself and 3 other members of the Black BWA study. We searched 5 electronic databases, as you see here. Next slide, please. We had 5 levels of search terms. And basically what this is you have level 1 gets at the vast categories of sexual misconduct victimization, of which there are many. So we wanted to make sure that we were as inclusive as possible to catch as many examples that might be relevant for our purposes. Then we were interested in, because you can imagine that if you look for any article on dating abuse, it could be anything from theory to conceptualization to programming. We have a level that is specific to prevention, intervention, programming, and levels 3, 4, and 5 try and get at the population characteristics that we want. And so basically, and the committee gave, or the scoping review team gave a lot of thought to this. We didn't just want, and I think of it as we've had these conversations, as 3 categories of goodness of fit, if you will. We didn't want just programming that was done anywhere. We narrowed it to educational settings, for example. So if there was good programming that was being done at a hospital or a counseling center, we said, yes, that's interesting, but we want to keep this in the academic setting writ large, K through 12, college, graduate school, wherever that might be. Bucket 2 speaks to the sort of race ethnicity piece, right? So we spent a lot of time thinking about, well, what if we found an article that was like 50% BIPOC and 50% white? Is that good enough? We decided that for that bucket, we would exclude studies if the sample was 100% white or race or ethnicity wasn't mentioned, but we would look more closely at any article that had representation among BIPOC individuals. And then bucket 3 was biological sex, which often gets conflated with gender. So if a study was 100% male and white, we would say, well, that seems like too far removed from our population of interest. But one of the things we've discussed as a group, and believe me, we've had a lot of conversations, is, in fact, just yesterday, well, what if, and we have an article that we're discussing, what if an article has, as one does, has a sample of white and Black men, and they analyze the data by race, would we include it? And so basically, as we encountered each of our articles, we thought, okay, what is the educational setting? What is the race ethnicity of population, and what is the gender breakdown of the population? Next slide, please. And so what we found, and I'm going to circle back to sisterhood, is what we found is that my original goal for AIM-1, right, where we would have this compendium of examples to share with Pitt of programming that has been used with or developed for Black undergraduate women, you end up finding basically no such programming. And what we found, even though we're not 100% done, what we found is that we get categories of studies that are close, but not quite what we particularly are looking for. So this is not to critique the studies, because they studied what they were interested in studying, but for the purposes of, would this programming help reduce negative outcomes for Black women who've experienced sexual misconduct victimization? There's nothing from our scoping review that helps point to any programming. So this is kind of where we're at. So the first example that I give you, and this is one of the few articles that so far has met our title and abstract review level and our full text review level. And as I said, because I don't want to go too sort of deep in the weeds about the scoping review process, if the audience is interested, I can tell you more than you want to know about that. But basically, thus far, the only article that has made it close to being what we're looking for is this study, and I apologize because I feel like I'm going to mangle her name, Dr. Elizabeth Terrazas Carrillo et al. Developed a study, or developed an intervention rather, and they talk in their article about, in many ways, they were speaking to the rationale for BWA, but their focus is Latinx college students, right? So in their article, they talk about how there is a paucity of interventions at the college level for, in their case, this is dating violence. And this is a nice way to sort of circle back to Sisterhood 2.0 for a couple of reasons. So when the scoping review team was thinking about, okay, what type of study is good enough, close enough to help us maybe, extrapolate and say it could be appropriate for Black undergraduate women, we actually did talk about Sisterhood 2.0. Dr. Hill's already given an overview of that study. And, and if we had come across an article that spoke to the findings for Sisterhood 2.0, where the population was either 50% or predominantly Black female, we would have included. But because of sort of the existing articles that we found through our scoping review, that didn't make the cut. I say that to say, so we have this study driven by Terrazas Carrillo et al., where they, again, first speak to the need for culturally relevant programming designed to reduce dating violence perpetration and victimization among Latinx Hispanic college students. And so to go back to the buckets that I mentioned earlier, because it was a college setting, we said we'd accept it. Because it was not 100% white, and in this case, it's 100% Latinx, it was okay to consider. And they had both men and women in the study. So I include this not to say like this is the programming that we would go to Pitt and say we need to implement, but this is an example of the close but not quite in terms of what we're interested in. So the only other thing I'll say for this slide is in the intervention, they were interested in a number of outcomes, both in terms of attitudes and behaviors. And I highlight this last bullet, that what they found after their intervention, it was about 6 sessions, I believe, that dating violence perpetration was lower among the women in their study when they compared pre and post levels. But in terms of victimization, which again is one of the things we're interested in, they found that there were for neither the men or the women in their study, there were no significant improvements pre and post intervention in violence victimization. And I say all that to say that, it's then even a harder argument to say to the University of Pitt, so here's this program developed for Latinx college students, doesn't have, at least based on this first pass study, doesn't seem to have any improved outcomes for victimization. Basically, I hope you can appreciate it's kind of a hard sell to make to say that this would be the programming that we would propose. However, based on our scoping review inclusion and exclusion criteria, we included this as something to report to the provost office with those caveats and limitations. Next slide, please. What we did find a lot of, right? So that first example was, okay, we got close, a BIPOC population, not the one that we're primarily interested in. But where we did find a lot, not a lot, but when your foundation is pretty much 0, a lot suddenly becomes 2 or 3 articles. So where we did find places where people did do analyses by race and gender is bystander intervention. And another thing that Terrazas Carrillo et al. Talked about when they were pitching the rationale for them developing their driven intervention was because it isn't that there is an absence of programming at the college level, but that a lot of it is bystander focused. And I do not say that as a slight or a limitation. I think that that is an important piece of the intervention mix, if you will. But and I'm not alone in this, can see a number of limitations to, and I'm not saying universities are doing this, but I see limitations to relying on the bystander approach to the exclusion of other things. Anyway, so Burns, Eaton, Long, and Zapp are an example of articles that did drill down and do analyses by race and gender. But now they're bystander interventions, so not surprisingly, their focus is on not whether you yourself are less likely to be a victim, to experience sexual misconduct, victimization, or to perpetrate such things, but rather, would you intervene? Do you have the skills, the intent, and equally important, are you more likely to intervene after this intervention? So what Burns et al. Did, as you see here, is they did an online bystander training program They had a sample of 750 female and male students. One of the reasons, and now this article has only been reviewed by one person, myself, so the other person still has to review to make her decision. But the reason why I thought that it met our threshold for inclusion is going back to what I said earlier. So if a study was 100% white or race or ethnicity wasn't mentioned, we would exclude it. Here, what we see is the sample is 59% Latinx, 19% Black, so majority are BIPOC. So that, so we have the college setting, the racial ethnic diversity, and the gender. So it fills all those buckets, if you will. And so what we see here is, again, because we're talking about bystander intervention and not whether you are less or more likely to perpetrate or experience such things, these results, similarly to Terrazas and Carrillo, don't really help us say to the University of Pittsburgh, here's a program we think you should do. It'll reduce the likelihood of victimization among Black undergraduate women, right? It doesn't give us that. What it does show us, as you see here, is that there are race and gender intersection of same differences in people's sense of bystander ability and intent. And next slide, please. And so I use this, and I guess, so if you could click the other two headlines, please. And I include, thank you, I include this slide reluctantly, but I think that it does a good job for me of articulating my primary concern with bystander intervention. I think it is great that people are being educated about situations in which someone should intervene, right? Because I think that there's so many ways in which we can normalize sexual harassment and interactions between people that can be interpreted as playful, or that's just how they are. And so I absolutely believe that bystander intervention training is useful to let people know that, no, this thing that you're seeing is not all right. And that in concert with other types of programming, I think that it is a good thing for people to, even though I think it can be overused, sort of see something, say something, that people should intervene when they think that somebody is in distress and it warrants it. And but the reason that I hesitate about thinking that that's where I would want to put all of my, and I say this as if I have funding, but where I would want to put all of my effort and energy is that we know, both from our lived experiences and from what we see in the world, that not all individuals get the same level of care, attention, outrage, force of anger, and something needs to be done, that not everybody is given that same, what should be an inalienable right? When one person goes missing, we should have the same level of effort for finding that person as we do for other people. And so my concern about bystander interventions is that while it's useful to give people like the general broad strokes of what situations warrant intervening, that I think there are so many ways in which people can do some sort of mental calculus and say, well, that's between this couple, and that's just kind of how they are. That's just how this group is. I'm thinking about, and I'm not going to say it nearly as eloquently as our previous BGA Summit speakers, right? But they were talking about in the panel about the ways in which the normal behavior of Black girls in schools is said that it's too much, right? You're too loud, you're too rambunctious. And it's not that big a leap to extrapolate to an interaction between a Black woman and her partner, whoever that might be, and say, oh, that's just the way they are, right? While one person is yelling at the other one. That's just what they do, right? I think that there's so many ways in which we can minimize interactions that are violent for some people and not others. And so that's my little soapbox speech of why I think bystander intervention is an important part of this puzzle of reducing victimization. But I feel that it will probably, and I can say a little bit about this later at the end if you're interested, based on my reviewing of articles for scoping reviews, they focus on the race and the gender of the potential bystanders. I've yet to see any articles that have looked at the race and gender, sexual orientation, all sorts of identities of the bystandee, you know what I mean, the person who might need intervening, and how that might impair or facilitate intervention. So that is my long way of saying, that one, in our scoping reviews, we do see race and gender analyses at the bystander intervention level. But I do believe that because of the intersection of racism, sexism, or misogynoir, if you will, that bystander intervention will not work for all populations unless we view all populations as worthy of intervening. Next slide, please.
So, Lenise, I actually would like to pause here, if you don't mind, for a few minutes and just get
sure.
some, see if people in the audience have any thoughts about, just these headlines. I mean, ultimately, this is a very current event. This is a pretty particularly jarring moment because there's been such an outcry on social media, I think, about a similar young people who have gone missing in the same area as this lower headline is pointing out. And basically that there is a huge, as you're saying, dichotomy between who is deemed worthy of this type of intervention. May that be, and Lenise and I have kind of talked offline a little bit about this and we got a little riled up, but thinking about the number of people who engaged in this search across, social media, across different places, who took it upon themselves to check, video footage and to look at, pictures and, zoom in and check this angle and look at this. And so this is sort of a detective culture that people have been able to take on, but again, has only really been targeted towards very specific individuals who have, gone missing or been exploited or been victimized. And so I think this is a really interesting conversation to think about. What does it mean and who does the public place value on in situations where they are being victimized across the board? And so I just wanted to pause there and think about that. I think some of what I'm going to talk about in a little bit is going to address some of the cultural issues that we have that really promote a society that only sees one color and not any of the others, or sees one identity and not any of the others. And that, a lot of the historical implications of our country and our society and sort of, colorism across the globe really has significant implications on who has value in these systems and is deemed worthy of this level of interaction. So I just wanted to pause for a second and see if we had any other thoughts.
No, I appreciate that, Dr. Hill. So that's why we're a good team. I was willing to just keep on going and give people a chance to marinate on that. I will look in the chat.
Yeah, and if not, no problem. I obviously having the opportunity to just talk a little bit about that, I think is important, and thinking about that when we're trying to decide what programming is most appropriate, and how we can really address cultures that deem certain people invisible in our various spaces. Mm-hmm. So I just, I thought that was an important point to make. So I will advance unless anybody has any questions or comments.
So I am on the chat. That's my job. And so I'm a little bit behind. So Erica says, and I think this was, she took my cue when I said to put things in, even if we moved on. She says, peer-to-peer after-school small groups, gives a citation, African-American girls' descriptions of life in high-risk neighborhoods. So peer-to-peer after-school small groups. So one, thank you for sharing that. And that is a really good segue to, even though I'm over time, so I'm going to, well, I don't want to speed up, but I'll try and be as short as I know how. And Dr. Hill will probably like, yeah, I'll believe it when I see that. Anyway, so I spent a lot of time on the scoping review, really just to get to the end, which is that we're not finding things that are centered around Black females' experiences at the college level. And honestly, I would have taken any article that was at the K through 12 level, but we weren't finding those either. Anyway. AIM 2, which I and one of the attendees in the audience are primarily involved in, is interviewing Black undergraduate women and some graduate women, some alums at Pitt, to do a host of things. We ask them a range of questions about their awareness of programming at Pitt, how they would like to see such programming improved, what ideas do they have for new programming? And this is a great way that Erica, unbeknownst to her, set me up for some of the feedback that we've gotten. And so far, I and another member of the BWA team, two of whom are in the audience, Dr. Alana Fields, have interviewed 12 women so far at Pitt. The study has been done virtually, and the women that we've interviewed have really been very generous of their time and thank you, Dr. Hill, of their time and their willingness to be vulnerable and to offer suggestions for this program. So, as Dr. Hill already advanced the slide while I was already talking, as I said, bullet one, so 12 interviews have already been completed. And so I'm going to talk very quickly about sort of two of the takeaways. So much like the scoping review, the interviews are also still in progress, right? So we have transcribed many of them, and we are really just at the very beginning preliminary stages of coding. So my observations are really just going to be, this is very rigorous. It's going to be on my recollections of the conversations I've had with the 6 women that I've interviewed, right? So in terms of the first point, we ask them, sort of what programs are you aware of at Pitt? And fairly consistently among the women that I interviewed, it was either they weren't aware of a whole lot of things, they named the counseling center as an example, or many of the 6 women that I interviewed talked about the first year experience sort of training module, educating students about, what consent is and things of that sort. So those were it was either I'm not aware of anything, there's a counseling center, or there's that first year thing that we did back in the day. So that's what they're aware of. And in terms of improving existing programming, very briefly, because I'm over time, in terms of the first year experience, pretty consistently, everyone who brought that up said that they felt that there should be, and I'm paraphrasing, refreshers or ongoing modules throughout the school years, right? So you come in as a first year student, you have a set of experiences, but you don't suddenly age out of possibly being in a situation that is coercive. So in terms of the first year orientation modules, a number of them said that it should be continued in some form or fashion. In terms of the counseling center, a number of the women who mentioned the counseling center is something that they were aware of. Fairly consistently, the women talked about how they would like to see, not unreasonably, counselors that sort of, better reflect diverse experiences, diverse lived experiences, diversity, whether it's race, ethnicity, gender, and LGBTQIA identity, all of those things. And so I, to a person, thank them for their very thoughtful feedback about, what seemed to me, and again, I'm not the one in charge of the purse strings, but seemed like very reasonable suggestions. And then lastly, I'll end with this. So suggestions offered for new programs and services. And this goes back to the comment put in the chat about peer-to-peer, after school small groups. The last person I interviewed, and this is very fresh in my mind, it was a couple of days ago, was talking about, and she was not the only one of the 6 people that I interviewed, was talking about how she would like to see a space where Black women with similar experiences, even though, sexual misconduct victimization includes a whole host of experiences, could get together and support one another and learn from another and sort of uplift one another in a space that was just for them. So I will definitely look at the article that was shared in the chat. But my last comment before I yield the floor to Dr. Hill is that new programming, again, this is not a very rigorous summary of my 6 interviews because this is more my recall, was that the idea of having peer support groups, and I don't even think that the topics had to be limited to, assault and other experiences, but just a space where people who look like them and have had serious, similar rather, lived experiences as they do can come together and support one another. So I have gone over my time. I think that's my last slide. No, it is not. So there we go. So last question for you before I give it all to Dr. Hill. What suggestions do you have for improving existing, so hearing what I went through very quickly, what suggestions do you all have for improving existing programming or creating new programming that addresses the needs and experiences of Black college women? Because the sad commentary is that there is so much more work that needs to be done in this space. I am not going to say that our scoping review was the most rigorous thing out there, but I wish we had a host of articles to choose from. And basically what we're left with is articles that are close, but not quite. So for people who are interested in this work, the good news is that the field seems very wide open, but the bad news is that the field shouldn't be wide open because we should be putting these programs in place for all populations. So,
Dr. Stokes, one thing I feel like I will add to sort of preliminarily shine some light on what we have been finding a little bit from some of your interviews and what you kind of mentioned previously in some of the studies that you found are that ultimately people want to see people who look like them, and that creates environments of comfort. So some of the things that we certainly can recommend from what we're finding in this particular project from the multiple aims is that, it may be really important that the Title IX office staff individuals who are from multiple backgrounds, that have multiple intersectional identities. I'm really, at the moment, sort of recalling a panelist in a conversation from the diversity forum that Pitt hosted, where the first openly transgender professor was speaking about their experience and about how, that wasn't something that was on their mind as they were kind of going through their academic journey, but ultimately the weight and the gravity of being the only one in this very large space. And so I think it's really important to create spaces where people see themselves reflected. And so that's certainly something that we can recommend to the provost office and to the Title IX office to make these the resources that are available on campus much more accessible, because I think what we're also finding is that people who are experiencing these really difficult and traumatic events don't even know where to go primarily. Or if they have gone there, that they feel that they haven't been received or believed or supported in the ways that they need. And so I think what it is encouraging from what we've found so far is that we do have some things that we can take back, I think, to the university, and that potentially you all could take back to your different organizations to really think about how to create environments that are more welcoming and more equitable, particularly for Black women, but I think also, for all marginalized identities that you are really trying to serve. So little 2 cents there.
Excellent points. Thank you. And so since my job is the chat, I just wanted to acknowledge, Erica, I'm not forgetting your question about bullying and harassment. And so I believe Dr. Hill will be able to finish in time for us to come back to that. So I just wanted to acknowledge that I'm not ignoring it.
We can go right ahead with the questions. I think that's way more important.
So it's question. Okay. So Erica says, I recently attended a conference that discussed bullying harassment as being an issue of power. Yeah. It was suggested that bystanders are necessary for bullying to occur in schools, as the bystanders would be witnesses of that power. What are your thoughts on power and victimization and how it is obtained and communicated? So thanks for the question. So first I want to try and I'll also let Dr. Hill answer too. So first I want to come back to this conference's premise that, if I'm understanding this correctly, that bystanders are necessary for bullying to occur in schools. And so I'm sort of struggling with that one, because I feel that bullies would bully whether they had an audience or not. And there's this weird thing, as I've already kind of sort of criticized bystander interventions for the reason that I gave, that whatever issues I have with my belief and others, that not all people are deemed equally worthy to be intervened with. I didn't say that quite as elegantly as I could have. I would never presume to say we shouldn't have any bystander training whatsoever. And I only say that to say my interpretation of this conference's thesis is that I fully believe that bullies would bully whether there were bystanders or not. And certainly there's probably some group of bullies that feed off on the crowd. But the flip side of that is then there are opportunities for people to intervene. And I don't know that necessarily gets to what you're saying. But your question is, what are our thoughts on power and victimization and how it is obtained and communicated? So I feel like books have been written on power and all that other stuff. So I'm going to try and do my best to work my way through this. So I think that, I mean, yeah, because so much can be said about why bullies bully. It's, and I'm putting on sort of my clinical psychology hat, it's partly because they do want power, whether it's because they feel they don't have it in other avenues, because there's something about this, and I don't mean this in a blaming way, there is something about the person that they are bullying that they feel is worthy of that bullying. And victimization and how is it obtained and communicated. And so, in some ways I think that, and let me know if this is getting what you're saying. I think in some ways it's first off, it's just so multi-determined. You have bullies that do so again because they're coming from a place of they feel less than, and this is a way for them to feel more than. Also, we do have a culture, not a culture, but we do have ways in which society minimizes this behavior. So I hope we've seen the death of boys will be boys, but I don't think so. So a lot of ways in which I think it's obtained is this. Now, of course, I'm being sort of heteronorm or gendered here by assuming that all bullies are male, so I apologize for that. But I think you do see some ways in which some of the bullying behavior is seen as part of rites of passage and the ways in which people navigate the world. So socialization, I think, is one of the ways in which power is obtained. Like, this is the appropriate way for you to behave. This is the appropriate way for you to resolve conflict. As opposed to what I think one of the things that both sisterhood and manhood do is challenge gendered scripts of how to behave. So power is partly obtained through through reinforcement of societal norms of what it means to be male, female, what have you. And I think that that can help also hopefully answer your question about victimization as well. Like, who is deemed, to have that status to be victimized? Because I will say this, even though I'm still being gendered, that I doubt the school bully is going up to the, big man on campus, if you will, right? There's something about that big man on campus's intersecting identities that puts that person in a position that is sort of hands off, whereas other people, whether it's because of their race, their gender, their sexual orientation, what have you, that gives them the role of, in the bullying's mind, of victim. Dr. Hill.
Yeah, so I think it's also really interesting to think about bullying in the context of the venue. So I actually think that from the K through 12 sort of spectrum of this, that having an audience is really an important part of that facility of bullying. And ultimately, to the point in the chat, that it does facilitate a certain amount of power. So having people be able to witness this thing, to feel whatever, the thing is that you feel from exerting that power over another individual, which in a developmental phase could be really dangerous. So I think that there have been some K through 12, particularly middle and high school interventions on bullying that have really done a great job with bystander intervention, because I think what it's doing is changing the norm, and it's challenging the norm of bullying in the sense that it creates a sense of power, and really challenging social norms around power imbalances and power dynamics. So I think in the context of higher education, talking about graduate school, and undergraduate, we're thinking about these relationships a little bit differently. And that's not to say that bullying doesn't occur in those settings, but it may be from a different standpoint after a person has already sort of developed these really harmful perspectives and these really harmful attachments to that type of power imbalance. So I think that, that point is really valid in the sense that, addressing bystanders at an earlier age, addressing bystander behavior at an earlier age is really important. But it may be a little bit more important to address cultural norms when you get to a later stage of young adulthood, and early adulthood overall. So I don't know if that helped answer that question, but I certainly think that it's a really important thing to consider. And I think we've been doing research on adolescence, so developmental stage is highly important, and really thinking about when the best time to intervene prior to some of these behaviors starting to take solidification is paramount. And so that's one of the things that I think when you're talking about these types of interventions that we have to think about.
So we have it. Oh, well, I think you can see the chat now. So we have a thank you from our questioner. Thank you for that. So Dr. Hill, with the time that we have left, I see that you stopped sharing. Does that mean that you don't want to go through
Well,
your
I mean,
slide?
I would love to, continue to have discussion. The
Okay.
slides that I was going to really talk about were honestly just thinking about how our society and sort of the culture against supporting Black individuals in this country have really perpetuated this invisible take of Black and brown individuals. And so really kind of going back to the headlines, of the Gabby Petito case and thinking about, some of the other young people who have gone missing around the same amount of time, whose parents are, funding searches themselves, going, driving cross country from, Carolina, one of the Carolinas to Arizona to like try and find out, where their son is. And thinking about the fact that, again, we were looking at people taking it upon themselves to check surveillance footage, to, go deep on some of these photos that were being released by the media. And then also thinking about the media coverage that was, widespread for this young woman when, thousands of other young women the same age with the same, potential and the same life have gone missing, have been missing, and have been exploited for so long, but don't get the same attention. And so I really think, ultimately we understand that some of the systems and structures, particularly structures like racism, have further perpetuated this and have been ingrained in the fabric of our identity as a country for so long. And so it's important to really integrate anti-racist practices into everything that we do when it comes to violence prevention, because ultimately violence against women, particularly Black women, is inherently racist. And it is formed and derived from these really difficult experiences from our very early ancestors in this country. And so they're inextricably linked. It's something that we have to be able to name and have to be able to find ways that our organizations are actively opposing it. And we have to think about how we are able to create equitable societies that not only address this, but uproot it.
Well said, Dr. Hill. And I mean, it's clear because behind the scenes, Dr. Hill and I were not debating, but I was discussing whether I wanted to include the slides of Ms. Petito because it was so recent and so raw. And I think one of the reasons that I decided to include that slide is because the reality is, and so I'm not a true crime sleuth. I wasn't searching these stories, and I say that to say, so my news feed would bring up aspects of the investigation, and at the same time, you would see people who were uplifting the experiences of the other headlines that I gave. The 710 Indigenous women who have been gone missing over a decade in Wyoming, and so it was interesting because I don't go into social media that much, but it was kind of a split, right? You had some people who were like, oh, it's too soon. Can't you let this family grieve? Meaning Miss Petito's family. Absolutely. But other people who are like, well, no, I need to use this opportunity to shine a light on all of these Black and brown boys, girls, young adults who are missing, because this level of energy is not afforded to them. And so, and I hope that this comes across. My take is not that we shouldn't be giving that level of energy to finding Miss Petito, but that we should be doing it for all the other people as well. And we've just gotten the notice that we have 5 minutes remaining. So let me go back to my job in the chat.
Yeah, I think, I appreciate Dr. Fields for putting Jelani Day's name right there in the chat. Again, someone whose mother has been pleading with the media to cover this, to really, give the same amount of energy to find her son, who's a graduate student in college, and really trying to understand what's happened to her child. Again, Daniel Robinson, whose father is funding his own search. And his son was a geologist on a mission, I guess is what you would call it. But, really, ultimately, all of these missing and exploited, and these are young men. So again, that there's a whole, you know, aspect of that where they're getting attention that brown women are not. And so, you know, again, really thinking about how do we create more equitable systems? How do we make sure that we're challenging that on a very local level to help our environments, our organizations to promote the things that are necessary to have equitable experiences across the board? How do we support not only survivors, but really think about prevention? What do we do to make sure that these experiences aren't happening? So whether that is intervening at an early age and really thinking about intervening on social and cultural norms, violence being really something that as US citizens, we've seen throughout the fabric of our lives, throughout the fabric of this country. So how do we start to challenge that as a mechanism of resolving conflict? And thinking about how to promote, you know, positive and healthy relationship building with our young people so that that becomes what's, you know, normal for them.
Well said. So we have 3 minutes left, and I welcome any remaining questions or comments that you have. Any feedback, any thoughts, any parting thoughts would be greatly appreciated. And then while I'm waiting for people to put things in the chat, the other thing is I keep going back to this bystander intervention thing and Dr. Hill's comment about the father who is footing the bill for the own investigation. You know, I wish there was, you know, because I don't want to make it sound again like this bystander thing couldn't work. Like, then I wish there was a way that we could bring that same level of energy to the online sleuthing of people who were, as Dr. Hill said, legit looking through footage and have that be applied then universally. Like, wouldn't that be a great use of social media? Whatever you might think of it, it could be used for ill, but why can't we just expand that to be used for good for other populations, for BIPOC girls, boys, transgender, non-binary individuals who are missing? Use that same level of internet sleuthing energy that you brought to Ms. Petito's case. Like, I feel like that's all I'm asking. You all clearly have the skill set, you have the time and the energy to do it. And, you know, ideally, I say this as a clinical psychologist, I would rather things not happen that we then need to fix, meaning I'd much rather that no one has to experience exploitation and abuse and assault. But since we do not live in that world, then let's make sure that we care and are concerned and are energized for all people who go missing, who are exploited, who are victimized. So that's my last soapbox. And with 2 minutes remaining, Dr. Hill, do you have any?
No, I think that was well said. I just, you know, want to make sure that we tell the attendees that we're going to continue to bring this information as we find it. I think last year we were in the idea phase. We had just, you know, maybe gotten funded, and so we were able to kind of talk to the summit a little bit about what we were intending to do. But I think that this space helps us stay accountable. And so we really are appreciative of you being here because it allows us the opportunity to make sure that we can give you what we're finding. And in real time, think about how this can be, how the information that we're learning can be used to inform some of the things that you all are doing in your various organizations on the ground. So thank you for being here, and we'll continue to provide you updates as we collect more information.
I think that's great, and I'll do this as quickly as I can. To the comment from the ED of PAR, who closed with feeling that PAR hasn't always been seen as a welcoming place for Black female clients, that I would say that, not to put words in Dr. Hill's mouth, that I think we would love to have, you know, offline conversations with you about how that we can change that and make that more welcoming. I'm not going to presume to have all of the answers, but I do think from the interviews that we've had, from the work that Dr. Hill and I do, that we might be able to come up with workable, sustainable ways to make PAR more welcoming for Black female clients, because that's what BJA is about, but for all people who, for whatever reason, need or will benefit from the services of PAR. So
thank you, Dr. Hill and Dr. Stokes, for your presentation and this wonderful fireside chat. And thank you for all the participants who participated. Please join us for our next session.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.